Excellent. Glad to hear it. Uh, Question on the whiteboard today. If you could choose to live forever, would you want to? Why or why not? Ooh, that's a good point. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's one I go back and forth on. I'm like, oh, there'd be some good things, but definitely there'd be some downsides as well. Say hopefully Curtis joins us shortly too. I don't think I got an email from him today saying he wasn't going to be here. But really the theme of this week is going to kind of be a deep dive into Unit 1. Today we're going to kind of focus on freedom of religion, and then we're going to get to some of the other parts of the First Amendment the rest of this week. But as you're jotting that vocabulary down, the big thing to note is we are quickly approaching the end of the semester, end of the school year. May 23rd is the last day to turn in work for this grading period. That'd be anything from units 5, 6, and 7. So if you do have missing assignments in government class, definitely want to be thinking about, getting caught up on turning those in, because we basically just have 3 weeks left. And ultimately, government is a graduation requirement. So we definitely want to make sure we're passing government if we're planning on graduating at the end of the school year here. And hey there, Curtis, glad you can make it. Then going over here to the student question. How does the government work? How to give money to help people? It's a good question. Ultimately, at its core, the answer would be it's up to Congress. Because remember, Congress has control over the government's budget. And so ultimately, for any money to go to anything, it has to be approved by Congress. So if, for example, we want to create, some new program that helps, people with medication costs, Congress is going to have to pass, some new law or legislation that approves the funding for that program. And so here, for example, you can look at the government's budget for 2022. The inner circle would represent where money comes for government, most of it. And sorry about that disconnect. I don't know what it is, but my internet's had hiccups all day. Hopefully it doesn't end up getting too bad. If it gets to the point where we're really not even able to get things done, I'll grab the recording from last period and share with you guys, but hopefully it stays relatively minor. But as I was saying, increasingly these days, government operates more money than it collects in taxes. So ultimately it has to take out loans to cover those additional expenses. And then the outer circle would represent where all that money gets spent, whether it's Social Security, healthcare, education, things like that. All right. So let's then start jumping into the First Amendment. So you have the First Amendment here on the right. Take a moment to kind of read through it. Ultimately, there are 5 freedoms or 5 civil liberties protected by the First Amendment. Share in the chat any that jump out to you, any you can find reading through the First Amendment here. We have the right to say whatever we want about government under freedom of speech. So that's one of our civil liberties protected by the First Amendment. 4 more. Any others we can find reading through the text here? Excellent, Noah. We got another one there, freedom of the press. Basically, the ability for news media to not be controlled by the government. And we'll explore those 2 in detail later on this week. We got 3 more. Excellent, Curtis. Freedom of assembly, which essentially is the idea that we as Americans can come together and form groups and organizations, that government cannot force everyone to stay separate from one another, that if we want to form an organization or a group, we have the right to do that. We got 2 left. And excellent. Yeah, Noah's got the next one there of petition, which is essentially the right to go before government and express our views on government. Do we think government should start doing something? Do we feel like government should stop doing something? So combined, the right to assembly and petition, those are what are kind of known as the protest rights. That's what allows groups of Americans to form, marches, protests against the government, as long as it's nonviolent. Once you have a protest that starts, committing acts of violence, that becomes a different situation, obviously. And then good. The final one, freedom of religion. Oops, let me get back to highlighter here. Which is going to be the main piece of the First Amendment we're going to kind of dig into today. So 5 civil liberties protected by the First Amendment: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assembly, and freedom to petition. So those are the 5 freedoms or the 5 civil liberties protected by the First Amendment. And ultimately, the first one being freedom of religion, which is maybe interesting to note that, out of all of the possible freedoms to list, why history, maybe it's not that surprising. So I have a website I want you guys to visit and take some time to kind of read through, some of the early history of the United States. And then once you're kind of done going through the web page, ultimately, based on what you learn on the website, why would freedom of religion be important to America, historically speaking? And I'll kind of give 10 minutes to both, check out the website and write up your response. So here's the link to the website in the chat. Also get it on the whiteboard here in case that's easier for whatever reason. And let's see here. We're at 141 here. So we'll take up until 151 if we need it. But first, take 5 or 6 minutes to just kind of read through the website, kind of process what the website has to say, and then come back and think about this question. And as always, if you have questions or need help, just let me know in the chat. All right, excellent. Both of you kind of sent in responses at about the same time there. Let me also grab some of the responses from last period just so you can kind of see what other people came up with. But yeah, both of you, great responses here. When you stop and think about the fact that, back in the 1600s, people were packing up their lives in Europe and, traveling across the Atlantic Ocean into this, new land from their point of view. That's really kind of a crazy decision for anyone to make. Why would anyone do that? Why would anyone just like pack up the life they knew in Europe and come over here to North America? But as you note, for many, it was religious reasons. Europe was in the middle of the Reformation, where you had all these new versions of Christianity that were popping up, and no one was really in agreement on what was like the right version of Christianity from their point of view. So there ended up being a lot of religious persecution. People got arrested and even killed for practicing the wrong version of Christianity, according to others. And so that was ultimately a major motivator for early colonists, was to come somewhere where they could practice their religion without fear of religious persecution. Now, that is not to say that every early colonist was a big supporter of religious toleration. Many of these groups that did come over were like, well, we want to come over to practice our religion of Christianity. We don't want any of those other versions of Christianity coming into our community. So that's not to imply that there was like this, from day one, the spirit of religious tolerance in the United States. But ultimately, that idea that a person should be able to practice their religion without the government attacking them for it or persecuting them for that, clearly is in many ways a foundational idea. So when we talk about freedom of religion in the United States, it's oftentimes worded or is described as separation of church and state. Or another way of putting that is a separation of religion and government, that government and religion should not be intertangled. They should be kept separate from one another. Or as James Madison put it, religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. Why might that ultimately be important? What potentially could go wrong if you were to mix government and religion together? So sure, absolutely. One is the fact that not everyone in America is religious. So if we're mixing government and religion together, that might be uncomfortable for those people who are not religious. Definitely, that could be one reason. It is one reason, absolutely, that we have this idea of separation of church and state. Any other thoughts or ideas on what potentially could go wrong or be an issue if government and religion were kind of merged together? Yeah, excellent. Noah, connecting it back to the history we were just looking at, we have a historical record that shows, well, that tends to not work out well. It would be England all over again, where potentially one religion becomes the favored religion under government. And if you happen to practice a religion that's not the favored one by government, you might be in trouble. You, for example, think of what if Hinduism became Hindu? Um, could result then in government passing laws like saying no longer allowed to eat beef, because under some Hindus, that's against their religion. So when we start using religion as a justification for the passing of laws, that might make sense to some people if it's also their religion. but is obviously going to create issue for those people who are not of that religion. So definitely we can see how, religion being in control of government could really create some issues here in the United States. What about the inverse of that? If government and religion were mixed together, we might also argue that that might have a problem for religion. As Madison says here, religion and government will both exist in greater purity if they are not mixed together. Because when we typically think of religion, what is like the purpose or the goal of really any religion, generally speaking? Whether we're talking about Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism. It's following a set of beliefs. And generally speaking, what are religious beliefs trying to do for a person? Yeah, to make them good. It's about morality, being a better person. And so historically speaking, when religions start to get in collecting taxes, other things that really take away from that goal of morality. And so, again, if we went back to Europe in the Middle Ages, we would have a good example there where, as religion became more involved in the concept of governing, it kind of had a corrupting impact, where then the church kind of became more concerned about things like money and land and power instead of focusing on teaching of morality. So history provides us with multiple examples that would suggest government and religion both can do a better job when they're kept separate from one another. Once you start mixing those things together, they often tend to have a negative impact on one another, and things tend to not work out well. Now, ultimately, this phrase, separation of church and state, you hear it a lot in discussion of American politics. Technically speaking, it is not in the Constitution. If, for example, you read back through the opening of the First Amendment, nowhere does it say the phrase separation of church and state. Having another outage. I'll try to make things quick here, so hopefully we can wrap things out before it goes out too many more times and slows things down. So again, this was kind of Jefferson's interpretation of the First Amendment. However, since then, it is an argument that has been put forward before the Supreme Court multiple times, and multiple times the Supreme Court has reaffirmed it or has referenced it in its rulings of saying, yes, based on what is in the First Amendment, we can use this to interpret that it means there should be a separation between church and state, that government and religion should not be intertwined in the United States. Now, breaking down what the First Amendment has to say about religion, it's really two pieces or two clauses. the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause would be this first half, saying that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So, what do you think that is saying if it says Congress cannot pass a law making the establishment of a religion or respecting the establishment of religion? Yeah, generally speaking, that is kind of how we would interpret the First Amendment. But what do you think specifically it means when it says Congress can't make a law respecting a religion? What do we maybe think of, or what do we hear when we see this word respecting? Exactly. Congress can't play favorites. Congress can't favor one religion or over another. Or, for example, Congress cannot establish one religion as being like the religion of the United States. Can't play favorites. Congress basically has to treat all religions equally. So that's the Establishment Clause. It says that Congress can't play favorites. Congress can't identify one religion as being like the religion of the United States. Then the second half would, of course, be the free exercise. Congress also can't pass a law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So what do you think? What might be another way of wording or understanding that phrase, free exercise? What are we maybe saying there? Exactly. Government also can't place restrictions on people practicing their religion. If a new religion shows up to allow it, people are free to practice the religion of their choice. Okay, so I'm thinking about that and saying, all right, I got an idea here. Guess what, government? My religion says I shouldn't pay taxes. I can't do it. It's against my religion. Does that mean I can get away with not paying taxes if I claim it's part of my religious beliefs? What do you guys think about that? And of course, right, the answer would be no. And why would that be? What, of course, could be the issue, right? Because you would still be breaking a law. By law, you have to pay taxes. If you then go to court and say, oh, well, the reason I did this illegal thing was because of my religion, that's not a magical get out of free card. So while everyone in America is free to practice the religion of their choice and to have their own religious beliefs, that can only be taken so far. That freedom cannot be extended to the point that you can violate other laws. Because ultimately, if a law has what we call a valid secular purpose, meaning outside of the world of religion, it has a legitimate reason to exist. And paying taxes would be one of those things. As much as some people maybe don't like paying taxes is important. It's how the government functions and is able to afford to have, a military and, run schools and build roads. There's a clear reason for taxes to exist. So if there's a clear reason for that law to exist, religious beliefs cannot be used as an exemption card. So even among the Amish, for example, which as a religious organization or community kind of separates themselves from mainstream society, doesn't really get involved in politics and government from their religious belief, don't really believe in paying taxes to the US government. They still got to do it. If, for example, an Amish community makes and sells furniture, they got to pay income taxes on that. Or another example is some religions have restrictive beliefs on the health care they can receive, including, for some, things like blood transfusions or vaccinations. And that can sometimes come into conflict with various state laws. For example, states tend to have a law that says, hey, if you're going to send your child to public school, they need to be vaccinated. We need a copy of their vaccination records. Now, as you can see here, looking at the map, quite a few states have religious exemption to that, but that's ultimately up to the state. Some states you can see do not have exemptions for their vaccination laws. And that is allowed because there is a secular purpose for those vaccination laws to exist. It's to help prevent, the spread of disease and people getting sick from one another. And so in some states, if you are unwilling to vaccinate your children, you're not able to send your kids to public school. Now, that's not the state forcing a person to get vaccination, because you can always homeschool a child. But again, depending on what state you're in, if the state has not decided to allow a religious exemption, those vaccination laws need to be followed if you want to send your child to school. Finally, let's talk about this example. As you've maybe noticed looking at dollar bills, on them they have this motto of "In God We Trust." Now, some people might look at that and at first say, well, hey, doesn't that violate the First Amendment? First Amendment says government cannot. So note that this was not always the motto of the United States. The country's original motto was the Latin phrase "E pluribus unum," which translated means "out of many, one." But in the 1950s, during the Cold War, as a way of America separating itself from the Soviet Union, we changed the motto to "In God We Trust." And at the time, some people did raise concerns that that was a violation of freedom of religion under the First Amendment. Ultimately, the Supreme Court's ruling was that because the phrase does not specifically identify the God of any one religion versus being religious speech. Same thing then is true with the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Under God was not originally in the Pledge of Allegiance. That phrase gets added again in the 1950s, but ultimately kind of the same thought process there for why that is allowed is because it does not specify the God of any one religion. It's considered to not violate the Establishment Clause, that it's not playing favorites with any one religion. So That gets us through freedom of religion for today. Tomorrow, then we'll start digging into freedom of speech. If you have any questions of like, well, what about this with religion? Or I heard that, religions can do this. Stick around. Let me know. I'm happy to answer things to the best of my ability. Otherwise, you guys are good to go. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I'll see you back here tomorrow. See you, Curtis.